Today, to do the introduction to our speaker, is McKaylee Glennon with AWI.
Be careful, because soon I'll be introducing you somewhere.
Thank you. Can I get away with taking off my mask if I'm up here?
Yes.
I promise I won't move any further. Scott asked me to introduce, Scott's my husband, by the way, and I am also from Cosmos College. I'm the science director for the Adirondack Watershed Institute over at the college, and he asked if I could introduce Jerry, and of course I said yes. I have worked with Jerry for years and years, and I wouldn't turn down the opportunity to introduce him, and I've had the chance to do that a couple of times in the past, but I will similarly feel woefully inadequate in trying to introduce Jerry, because Jerry is not a person that's easy to describe in any sort of couple of phrases or words or descriptions, because he is so many different things. He is, as you will hear about today, a tremendous naturalist, the best that I have ever known and will ever know, I'm sure. He is an author. He has written on multiple topics. You'll see out there if you haven't come across his books before, but you name a topic in the Adirondacks and beyond, and he's written about it. He is lots of other things in addition to being a tremendous naturalist and an author and communicator of science. He is a person who I appreciate as understanding better than most anybody I know the importance of having the ability to communicate science in a way that's artistic and beautiful and in a way that captures people, and you'll see that today too. I have had the luck and the pleasure of being Jerry's colleague and friend for a lot of years. We were working together at the Wildlife Conservation Society for a long time prior to me coming to Paul Smith's, and if you are a friend and colleague of Jerry's, it means that you periodically will get emails that say things like, "Off to Cape Cod to get some twigs." And if somebody else sent you an email like that, you might sort of wonder, look sideways at that person. But with Jerry, you know that it just means that not only are those incredibly important twigs, but Jerry will find them in the exact location that he knew that they were going to be. And he'll bring them back, and he will show them to you, and he will photograph them, and he will illustrate them, and he will write about them, and describe them in such a way that you'll wonder how you ever could have got through all of your life before that point, not knowing how exquisite those twigs could be. And that's sort of how I would describe him. He is, in addition to being, an artist and a writer and a naturalist and a scientist and a botanist and all of those things, he's also a musician and a dancer. He did both of those things at the racetrack in Saratoga, and he'll talk to you about that. He's dabbled in physics. He can talk about anything. I've never come up with a topic that Jerry couldn't expound on and teach me lots and lots of things about. He's a terrific field cook. He's an amazing paddler. Those are just some of the things I don't have time to tell you about Jerry. But I'll tell you one story. I have lots of them, but I'll tell you one story that I think captures Jerry. I credit my dad with giving me, from the time that I was tiny, a love of swamps. There was never a beaver dam that would stop Bob Lennon, and we traveled over all of them in a canoe all the time in swamps, and so I've always loved swamps. But I credit Jerry with teaching me a love of a particular kind of swamp, and that is our peatlands, our sphagnum fens and peatlands and bogs and mires in the Adirondacks that have amazing names like Massawepie and Madawaska. They are sort of some of the charismatic mega wetlands of the Adirondacks, and they are the places that make you feel like somebody picked you up and dropped you, 500 miles to the north of here in the Canadian Boreal. And I've been in some of them with Jerry, and it's an amazing experience. And one of those is Spring Pond Bog, which is a place that I would encourage all of you to try to go to once in your life. It is, 900, 1,000 acres, miles and miles of sphagnum, as far as you can see, open peatland, dotted with tiny little black spruce and tamaracks. Just an unbelievably amazing and beautiful landscape. Doesn't look like anything else you might have seen. And we were, Jerry and me and some other nerdy bog type of people had traversed the bog and gone out to walk to, there are a couple of tiny actual ponds in Spring Pond Bog, and we walked to the edge of this pond that was It's very small, smaller than this room. And as you might imagine, if you're in a boreal bog, it is filled with the darkest water that you can imagine. You know, it looks full of acid and tannin and dark and sort of creepy, and you picture those bog people that you hear about that get preserved. You picture them floating under there, sort of, you know, that kind of thing. And we're standing there next to this little pond, floating on the edge of the bog mat, and somebody, I don't remember who said this, but somebody asked the question of, you know, how much is floating? And I wonder how far you could go under the edge of this. You know, it's kind of which parts are grounded and which parts are floating bog. And before we realize it, I look over and Jerry is taking off his shoes and putting down his backpack, and he jumps into the pond. And he not only jumps into the little creepy dark pond, but proceeds to swim under the edge of the bog mat in a place that I would never in a million years have the courage to go. And we all just kind of stood there slack-jawed until Jerry came back out a few minutes later with a handful of sphagnum and, you know, an explanation for us of just how far you could swim under the bog mat and what was under there. And that has always been the story that I think of when I think about this man who I love so much, who knows everything there is to know about the natural world and doesn't ever let anything get in his way of learning more about it. So if you ever get the chance to go in the field with Jerry, jump at it. There's nobody else like him. If you don't, then this is the next best thing. So please join me in welcoming Jerry Jenkins.
McKaylee and my colleagues, her colleagues at the WCS Adirondack program were, are, will be simply the joy of my life. Thank you all for coming. And I'm just going to tell you a story of how 10 years ago we got into a project, and we're not finished yet. We've done a good deal. We have saved the very exciting things for last because they were also the hardest thing. So I'll tell you this story and a disclaimer. Everything you're going to see is designed for the world of either physical things. This for the olders of us, you remember books, of things that you can hold, or of small screens. And for me, a small screen goes up to this big or is twice as big, but they're designed for a small, sharp world close to you. So they'll be poorly represented on the big screen. That's not their milieu. But I have pieces, samples, all the books to date, and so on out there. And when we break off, you know, if you're interested, I'll walk out there to talk to people, stand around, look at them a little bit up close, because natural history is about detail, and this is all about detail. Oh, I like that.
Is that too dark for everybody? That's a bit dark.
Can you hear me if I just hide behind the lectern? Invisibility is a good thing. It's 11 years ago. It's August. People in the Adirondacks very kindly select people for something called Lifetime Achievement Rewards. And it's a really tricky calculus. You want the person to be far enough from the end of their lifetime so they'll actually show up at the award ceremony, but close enough to the end of their expiration date that they've done something. So I'm 66 or 67. I guess I was 66 at that moment. And you talk about stuff, and then people ask you, well, what you're going to do next, which at that kind of thing is a very kindly question because it assumes you'll do something next. And I say, well, you know, things have gone incredibly well. I mean, people gave me a chance to work on books, history, graphics, research, all over the Adirondacks, all over Vermont, a lot of other places. I got to write about the Adirondacks as a whole. I got to write the history of acid rain research and the amelioration of acid rain, which is a historic study. I don't mean historic, I mean a heroic story, and it's a story in which Adirondack people and Adirondack institutions are in the front internationally. And then I wrote about climate change, which is a story that I still see a lot of optimism, but I also see incredible, no, I won't mince words, terror that was not there 10 years ago. But, so what next? Well, the answer I give is that, you know, I've been privileged to write about all of these things are important. I've never actually written about what I do in life, which is to try to go to places and think about the creatures, especially plants that live in them, the patterns in which they live, and to report on and teach people about, call it biodiversity in the raw, you know, the kinds of trees, the kinds of mushrooms, the kinds of mosses. So I said, okay, well, you know, whatever working time I have left, it's really time for me. You know, I've spent 40 years learning these things, to put them down. And my friend, the pilot, adventurist, philanthropist, kindly man behind the scenes of many good things, Ed McNeil, comes up afterwards and says, oh, well, that sounds very nice, but it's a couple of $1 million project, and you're going to need a board of directors, and you're going to need a foundation, and come over to my house tomorrow afternoon, we'll start putting the paperwork together. And so that's how the Northern Forest Atlas project comes about. And what is it we were going to do? What is it that we promised some very, very good people who said, okay, you know, that's kind of interesting, we'll support it and see where it goes. What we said is that, you know, I know stuff that's useful, but I've kind of said a lot of the things I know already, but I also know how to do stuff. And to do stuff, you need tools. And I'm pretty good at making visual tools. So there's going to be, whether the world stays the same, whether the world changes, there's going to be another generation of conservationists, there's going to be another generation of naturalists. There will have to be people that know what they're seeing, that can think about it. Again, I won't mince words. The incredible irony of climate change is that it comes, you know, think of the millions of years of history, think of 100,000 plus years of history of Homo sapiens. Climate change comes to threaten the living Earth in almost the exact same decade when we, for the first time, have the tools to be aware of what it's doing, and we also, amazingly, have the tools to do something about it. So we have this strange dual role, the threateners of the planet, and the only ones with the width of viewpoint, the technology, the scientific skills, the compassion that extends beyond us to a whole planet. So we're both the cause and the solution, which is a really strange place to be in. But anyway, so I said people are going to need tools. I'll make tools, and I'm good at graphics, and you won't see these, but my history with field guides goes back to, you know, looking at butterflies as a 5-year-old and lying in a cow pasture with a little flashlight and a blanket and learning stars from the golden books. I've been a lover of field guides as long as I can remember. And of course, the whole series of classic Petersons from the 40s and 50s, this small format. And being a book designer means being a copier of books, so I can tell you everything about those Petersons, what the type is, what the spacing is, the sizes of the books, the size of the bold headings. You know, they have been studied. But I love field guides, so I said, I'll make field guides. And, you know, and so we did. And then of course the question becomes, well, there are a lot of field guides out there. Why were you going to make some more? And you know, my overall answer, and it was kind of a quick answer, but we have stuck with it, is that the classic field guides I learned from are species by species. They compare species, but they have almost no ecology in them, which means that they tell you very, very little about where things are in the landscape, who lives with whom. They tell you how you tell an X from a Y, but they never tell you that species need one another. You know, and I'm writing field guides, I'm not writing Sunday sermons, but nonetheless, everything I've seen in 50 years convinces me that species need one another, and that community and cooperation is not an accident to be explained, it is the core. Alrighty, so, you know, I'm about to take you through the Atlas project, and I'm about to take you into you know, we make a lot of decisions along the way, and I'll speak about some of these decisions. This is sort of where we are now. The dark books are photographic books. There's a fourth one that just goes off to print next week on grasses and will be around be out in April. The two white books, you won't see the dates, but are dated 2022, 2023. Nope, 23, 24. They're in the works right now. And the black books are out there. And the black books are photographic books, so they're pretty big. And none of that was planned. I started this whole thing planning to make small field guides, pocket books, like my friends do. Again, you won't see them, but books like this for 4 knapsacks, for back pockets. And I didn't plan to use photographs because, number one, in 2011, there were very few satisfactory field guides using photographs out there. It was just really hard to take sharp photographs, and most field guides with photographs failed. And the other thing is that you really can't, Peterson, in a format this big, if he needed to, he could squeeze 18 warblers on a page to show you the differences. And you simply can't, you can do that with drawings, you can't do it with photographs. So I had no intention of doing photographs, but then things happened. And they always do. And the reason I had no intention was I couldn't take a sharp photograph of any of the small details I cared about. But then just about 2011 and 12, software became available that allowed you to put a single bud or leaf or a head of a grass or even a tiny capsule of a moss, 3 millimeters, in front of your camera, take anywhere from 5 to 200 images of it, and then put them together in the computer. And the images are basically little slices of a thing, slice, 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 each one of which is sharp. And the computer throws away all the non-sharp parts and sandwiches them together. I had seen this in the 20-aughts, and what I knew about it was it wasn't very good. It really looked kind of hokey, like you were building pictures out of Legos. But then all of a sudden in 2012 I saw pictures from the insect people that were mind-blowing, and I said we had to do that. So I made a studio like that at home. That's 2-3 times the size of the lectern, and now it's 20 or 30,000 pictures later after that, out of that studio. Experimented with white backgrounds and black backgrounds, and backgrounds were just the thing. So, and again, you won't see the sharpness in these, but you will see it in the books and in the posters out there. I was able to take really sharp pictures of almost any detail I could bring in the studio. And then in the next few years, I learned how to take similar pictures outdoors though not when the sun is shining and not when the wind is blowing. And between the two of them, there are not that many days of the year. So I stayed centered on the studio. And so all of a sudden I had something new, and I was going to just take these to base my drawings on. You know, so these were just going to be sort of study stuff. And when we started looking at these, we said, no, you know, these are a resource. These are showing us details that no one has seen before. And they're allowing us to put pictures together. The black background cropped to the objects allows us to make montages. And we can really start comparing the details with stuff. So the first thing we said, and we being collaborators, friends, the Atlas board, Ed again, there's been a lot of discussion with several publishers. Cornell became a year or two later our publisher and will be the publisher for the whole series. Wonderful, wonderful to work with them. So then we said, okay, well, what can we do that's not been done before? Because there's no reason to make a field guide like any other field guide. And we said, okay, given the black background and that kind of space, we can bring the text really close to the pictures. That is, we can bring the thing described and the descriptions right into juxtaposition like that. And if we do that, you know, again, I much respect the traditional field guides, but they spend an enormous amount of time describing. And a lot of that description is not diagnostic, but you have to say something. But if the pictures are showing you this much, you could go with fewer and fewer words. It turns out, Samuel Clemens mentioned this, that it's much harder to write 100 words on a subject than it is 500 words. And it's even harder to write 20 than it is 100. So it doesn't necessarily make it easier, but we could bring things close together. And then we started thinking, okay, well, we've got the power of the imagery, we've got the power of the words. What are we missing? Well, pictures are the thing themselves, but identification depends on there being, I simply call it a model, and that's a fair word, but a framework in your head of how things should look like, because we use a lot of abstract categories: sphagnum moss, oak, ryegrass, and I wanted to be able to take apart details that weren't in the pictures. You know, plants are a little bit shy. They got leaves over leaves. Many of them, especially my beloved mosses, are really low contrast. So, you know, they're like a fine, glossy black snake. You know it's made up of all these separate scales, but you can't see where one ends and one begins. So I started making drawings, which was a lot of fun since I can't draw, but I can diagram and map. And so I sort of built on that, and the drawings were there to represent, so the left drawing in the Carex section Rostrales is a drawing of features that are common to that whole group, and there are two members of the group. So they weren't quite as specific as pictures. I did drawings to take the mosses apart to show details of cells, of leaves, of leaf arrangement that you couldn't see in the pictures, or you could sort of see. And again, natural history is learning not only what things look like, but how to see patterns within what they look like. And then, so I wouldn't have to say things so much about habitats, I created a whole series of icons for 40, 60 different plant habitats, and I just used them as tags. So we had all these tools. Well, what kind of a book were we going to make? And this is where design questions get really interesting. They're the big leagues. There were a lot of tree books out there. All of those are very different. None of them is wholly satisfactory. All of those was a masterpiece at the time it came out, and almost all of them are still in print nowadays and still noteworthy books. So what could we add to this? We could add, first of all, our promise to really start putting ecology in these books. But the other thing is we could do some stuff that could have been done but hadn't been done. That says 1958. It's the Peterson Guide to Woody Plants. It's by George Petrides. It is the last book for this region, over 60 years ago, that covers both trees and shrubs. So if we covered trees and shrubs, we would do something that was needed and hadn't been done. How many of those books show all the flowers and all the fruits and give you a framework for identifying flowers and fruits? The answer is none. How many of them treat the buds in detail for winter identification really carefully with really good illustrations? The answer is none. So we had a niche. Now these are very different sorts of books, and the last couple of slides, next two slides are just because they're just, these are not for you to think this way, but I'm a data analyst, and before I do anything I have to kind of design it and think it through. And I started thinking of the shortcomings of books. And this wonderful tree book has almost no text in it, and it only has one picture per page, so there's one species per page, so there are none of those Peterson confusing fall warblers pages with 20 species there. This wonderful grass book, two dear friends of mine, it's again treats a single species or two species per spread, so it doesn't do comparisons. So, and I say these are not shortcomings, but they are design features. So, and again, what this grass shows you, and it's going to get more concrete in a moment, is you have choices to make. And whether you call them trade-offs, whether you call them design or engineering constraints, they're very hard to escape. And one set of trade-offs is how many words you get to put with each species. Another is how many species you get to put in a single eye span. And these things are at war with one another. If you put a lot of species on a page, your illustrations get smaller and smaller. And if you put a lot of words on a page, the number of species you can compare gets smaller and smaller. So this is a space you can't escape. And when you actually look at some of these wonderful books, you find that they all had choices to make. Not better or worse, but just what kind of a book you're going to make. We decided in our I call them photo guides, now in our first series of books, which is just completed this week as I send the grasses to print, that we would go all the way down in that right-hand corner, have as little text as we could get away with. We reneged on that a little bit for mosses and grasses, which are just more complicated, but have a lot of species per page. So we set ourselves there. But that clearly wasn't quite good enough for everything. So then we did what any good engineer will do, which is to say, how could we cheat? Okay, there are rules, but what do the rules leave out? It's not on that graph, so it's on the next one. The George Simmons tree and shrub books of the early 1960s had taught us how to cheat. And the amazing thing is that he laid out, you know, how to win at poker without holding all the cards. And people have loved his books ever since, but no one, till us, has emulated them in a serious way. So he said, well, okay, we'll have both kinds of pages, but the first third of the book, which he calls Pictorial Keys, will be comparative pages, a lot of different species, a lot of different genera, and they enable you to make a pretty good guess. And text, Simmons was not into text. He said, I'm going to let photographs and just a few annotations do it all. But then, if you guess here, in the second half of the book, there's a whole page showing you buds, leaves, bark. And this is what we basically emulated. So the first third to a half of our book, I call it the navigation part or the comparative part. We put lots and lots of species on a page, very little text. We encourage guessing. And you know, in one sense, this project has completely flopped, which is the sense that I was absolutely counting on that once I got these things down on paper, I would be done teaching and having to talk about them. You know, I was just saying people will use them, it's out of my hands now. But it turns out that these books open up the possibility, and I won't say much about this in this lecture, for teaching in rather new and different ways, because you don't have to be the authority. You can, the students with the books are their own authority, and all you have to do is be there, you know, sort of as the coach. They carry the ball and run down the field, and it's quite wonderful. But in order to use the books, you have to learn how to guess. You have to say, oh, I guess that's a heron. I guess that's a big heron. And that's not easy. So what I realized after I had written them was that we had built a whole method around guesswork. But especially, you know, and especially established able naturalists hate guessing. And, you know, the ones that can guess, they've got all the cards. But I realized I had to teach people, flog people, encourage them, play kids' games with them, in order to free up their minds, in order to teach them how to guess in groups that they didn't know. And so that's been really interesting. But anyway, you make a guess there. And I should follow this up. Those are lots and lots of trees and shrubs with lobed leaves. I should follow it up with then a species page for lobed leaves, but I didn't. But so after you go there and guess, you would not go to this page, but if you've seen a lot of evergreen plants, then you can go to actual pages. And here again, I still keep a number of species in this first woody plant book, but then you could go to a whole batch. I call these the species pages. And so that's the pattern. I took it right from Simmons. I credited it at first. It's a wonderful way. It's worked. You know, there are probably some people with rival methods, and they work wonderfully too. I know of people that teach and write totally differently. But let me tell you that with Simmons' books, with our books organized like this, we've got students up there that are tearing up the natural history world. I mean, you know, an incredibly brilliant young botanist, young to me is 39, by the way, named Matt, basically taught himself almost all the mosses over one winter. Well, there's only one Matt in the world, but no one has done that. So, you know, I'll speak for the system. Now, about this ecology stuff. Okay, here it gets interesting. Ecology means all different kinds of things, but I won't lecture on that. Ecology is useful in different ways in natural history, and I will simply say that it is useful when you want to find things, In other words, okay, I really want to see so-and-so. Where do I go? Well, often there's a pretty narrow answer to that. But it is also for everyone that works, either professionally or simply has become an able naturalist. It is built into the way we identify things. A bird with black wingtips flying way out over the sea, diving with straight wings into the water and then going home to nest on a cliff is most certainly not a nuthatch. And in fact, you know, given what I just said, it's almost certainly a gannet. Could be a kittiwake, but they fold their wings when they end the dive. There are 300 or so mosses widely distributed, some rare, some common in the northern forest region. Only about 15 to 20 of them at most, and often far less than that, occur on the bark of trees. If something is on the bark of trees and it's making little rounded cushions like that, and the leaves are really skinny, and when they dry, they really curl up like corkscrews, there's really only one moss it's going to be. Should you check? Of course you should check. You should always check. Nature likes jokes. But that kind of elimination by what is possible in the habitat, and then we call it overlaying. So simply as you're walking up there, you say, okay, round dark mounds on tree bark. Hey, I'm down to about 5 things. What do I look for? Okay, I look for those really curly leaves, and I look for the leaves to be really skinny. And then if it's got moss capsules, they'll be curved. That, you know, that takes me down really to just one. And identification doesn't, even in technical groups, does not get any faster than that. So, you know, if you're not using habitat cues, you're really not in the league anymore. It's gone beyond that. Here's another way to say that. When we walk up to something, already 50 feet away, 5 feet away, we're asking questions. We're saying, is it going to show me this? Is it going to show me that? Knowing what lives in the habitats tells me what questions I need to be asking and what questions I absolutely don't need to be asking. So it's a very powerful tool. I originally was going to save that for the part of the project that was field guides, but talking with my moss colleague, Sue, and I've taught with her for almost 20 years or more, there was no way we could imagine teaching mosses without teaching habitats. So moss maps had to go in the books. And so, you know, that's a moss, a mat of a ledge. The mosses are just those little things, but then, you know, there's more on the page of the book, but then you sort of pair them with the actual pictures of them. So you have moss mats combined with pictures, and that is the sort of thing that someone fluent, facile in this group, carries in their head as they walk up to the cliffs. Well, okay, one's nice, but then, along with our books, from the start, I really like to have lots and lots of stuff in a single eye span. You know, it's sort of fun flipping through pages of a book, flip, flip, flip until you come to what you want. But it's also really nice to know that, and you'll see some of our big posters out there, that the thing you're looking for is somewhere right in front of your eyes or very near. So we make, and I'll unfold some of these after the lecture, but we make folding charts for each of our books. And for each book there are 2 charts, so there are 4 sides, so you don't have it totally within one eye. But for the mosses and for the grasses, the folding charts are mixtures of moss mats and then the species in that map, and then, you know, the last thing, and it's not quite the end of the lecture, but it turns out that you can't do without the words, but that the words, Peterson was a genius at this, the words have to be diagnostic, by which I mean, you get nowhere by telling a person that a tree has leaves on the edges up by the sky and roots in the bottom, and there's this middle thing with bark on it. You know, so a great deal of description is nice. I mean, trees are lovely, but none of that tells you what an oak is. So that for every creature, to the extent that it has a defined identity, there are things that give it that identity, and the pictures will show them, but the picture combined with the diagnosis, combined with the words, has a power to clarify. Here, this is just, if we go back to this one, upper right-hand corner, there are a couple of maps. That's a cornfield up above. That's a nice gravel pit or river shore with pools and seepage and things like that. And I don't think you'll see very clearly, but that's the cornfield. It could be my cornfield. Many of your cornfields are the same. They're little tiny mosses. And just starting from scratch in a book, they're hard. But how many mosses in the cornfield are bud-like with broad leaves surrounding the capsule? Exactly one. How many mosses in the cornfield have long, skinny leaves that come up like a cedar tree and then the capsule's nested among them? Exactly one. How many mosses have bendy capsules? Well, more. 3. So once again, I promised myself I wouldn't preach, but I'll stop. But if you mix habitat diagnosis with a fairly simple set of features, identification turns into a much clearer and simpler game. You go from 300 possibilities and all kinds of technical stuff with cells you have to look like, to something that you can often recognize even before you reach down to pick it up. Well, as we've gone along, and we're now 10 years in this project, though we had lots and lots of stuff to do, photo libraries, libraries of drawings. So it was only about 2018, and the project actually starts. We do a lot of organizing in July 2012, so 6 years into the project, our first book appears. And anyway, as we go along, we find other things that are necessary. And so we had diagrams of habitats, but I really wanted to start including habitats. And it's not possible to photograph a beach in such high resolution that you can see one little tuft of moss somewhere back among the dune grass or something like that. But it is possible to photograph characteristic habitats and to list at least the commonest or most characteristic species of each. In the Adirondacks, that's an ampersand pond, but we often have floating logs or shoreline logs left over from the log drive days. They develop little mini bogs on top of them, and call them log bogs. They're quite wonderful. They have pitcher plants and sundews and sphagnum, and they're not that many mosses, and they come over and over again. So anyway, we started ending each of our books with a gallery of habitats like that. But then we had not a problem, but we had an opportunity, which is that we were shooting pictures that we were going to print 1.5 to 2 inches high in a book. But with the studio setup that I showed you in the first image, we had enough detail in these pictures that I could blow them up to fill a retina screen on a Mac. And basically I could blow them up like a 20 to a 70 times microscope and see the details. And again, we said, okay, well, I put 800 of these pictures in a book, and they're nice, but they're small. But I have 5,000 moss pictures, not all of them good. We wanted people to have access to them. So we made for each book a companion digital product. And it's called a digital atlas. And what it has is several thousand, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 pictures. And, you know, because it's a digital format, the pages are big. I can have as many pages as I want. There's no printer. No one cares about the shipping cost or anything. And so I can do detailed comparative pages like this with notes. And I can blow things up. So the left picture is blown up from that thing with the berries there. But on the screen, or these things are glorious on an iPad by just, you know, opening your hand up, you can fill a whole screen with just a small portion of one of those images. So again, you can take that upper center image, or an image like it, I forget, it's not the upper center image, but you can blow it up till you can see each individual little scale leaf and so on. So these things are the digital atlases. We said to the board, what should we do with these things? Try to sell them? You know, sell? And the board said, no, let's give them away on our website, free. And we also have libraries of 5,000 or so other images on the website. So as we built this website, we provided lots of products, and I think the digital atlases are really our flagship products that are simply there for free download and for any kind of personal, educational, non-commercial use. In other words, we're happy to have credit, but you don't even have to ask us. If you have the digital atlas, you want to use a picture, some pictures in a lecture, if you want to make out handouts for your kids in a class, use them. That's what we make them for. The digital atlas also, I have a lot of landscape pictures, and there will be coming in 2 to 3 years a digital atlas of landscapes, again showing the kind of things that live in different places. But we put those in. So here's where we were, here's where we are as of today. Coming attractions, the Grass book and the Grass Digital Atlas are done. And the Grass Digital Atlas has comparative illustrations like this. Those little grass spikelets and flowers are maybe 3 millimeters wide or so on. And they'll, on a sharp PC screen or on a phone or on an iPad, they're pretty stunning. And then that's just a page from the Grass book. Grasses have a complexity, not a difficulty, but simply a complexity that none of our other groups do because of how they're packaged. They have flowers wrapped in bracts, wrapped in more bracts, and then often packaged together in a fairly dense cluster. And you have to be able to mentally, but also physically, sort of unpack them to see what's going on. So, I'll do it from over here. With the Grass book, we had to integrate both photos just right in the midst of our species text, not for every species. We had to keep reminding people that these are whole things that live in places. Then we had to have pictures of a lot of small things. We had to put labels on for the parts. But then I also had to, for each genus, draw diagrams. So the lower right row, those are not photographs, those are labeled diagrams. So we had to sort of invite people, as I showed you in an early slide in this, to look fairly deeply into things and provide paradigms, models for what they'll see. That's where we are now. I'll spend 5 or 7 minutes in a quick tour of where we're going. I'll take a few questions if you have any from here, because it's easy for you all to hear me, but then invite you just to come outside and look at some of these things. Having done that, we've done pretty well. We've done now 4 photo guides, 4 digital atlases, 4 sets of charts, about 950 species so far. The total number of pages in the digital atlas is somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, I think. So it's not been small. The great thing for me is that the really challenging stuff is either ahead or it's right on my doorstep right now. And the challenging stuff is making small books with stuff packed in. So I've been working for years on designing the tree and shrub book. It will be just a little bigger than a classic Peterson, and just a little. And exactly the size of Pat Lynch's wonderful, amazing Long Island Sound book. And so a lot of thought has been given to putting it in. Here's a really quick tour. Structural parts. Very similar to our photo guides. Upper left over there, you need a glossary. Upper right, you need ecological maps. Center, you need guides to things. But in this case, this is why woody plants are, in a sense, the crux, the hardest field guide in the whole series, because you have to deal with winter buds, summer and winter leaves, spring flowers, summer and fall fruits. So all those things. So there will be guides, the comparative guides, and then there'll be species pages. These 2 layouts that you just saw are getting very close to our final layout. All of these others are just provisional. What they are made of, instead of photos, is, I call them cartoons in an old sense of the word, but they are vector drawings made in Adobe Illustrator. Again, this doesn't do them very good justice, so I'll just skip over. But here's a quick tour of the parts. So there has to be a glossary, and since it's a visual book, you have to define the words visually. There have to be ecological maps. And the way I'm doing these nowadays, and you'll see some of that out in the foyer, is I create sequences of landscapes, again cartooned, highly generalized. So there's a portion of a sequence of northern forest landscapes, a batch of peatlands there, and then divide that into habitats or vegetation types, and then again cartooning, show who lives with whom and where. If you're going to have a lot of leaf guides, you have to have a guide to the leaves, and then if you pick one of those, say upper left, needle and scale leaves, you certainly want to see all the spruce, hemlock, larch, crowberry leaves on the same place. So these are the guides to guides. This would be a guide to all the maples. And again, this is borrowing right from Peterson. So there's a comparative page, and for each maple, a leaf, a bud, a flower, a fruit, and separating, for instance, wind and insect-pollinated flowers. Very simple things. And that will be enigmatic from where you sit, but it's a very simple breakdown of the northern forest into an oak zone, boreal wetlands, northern mixed forest, mountain conifer woods, alpine tundra, and then you can start drawing in, this is where red maple lives, this is where box elder and silver maple live, this is where striped sugar maple mountain live. Nobody gets into the high conifers or alpine. So, ecological maps, and I can read. There's the species page. That will get redesigned, but that's the basic idea. And then, here I shudder, because only 2 years away now, I promise to be well into a book that pulls the ecological information from these other books and writes about pattern. And I've only been thinking about this for 40 years, but I'm still scared. So, but here are just some very quick thoughts to end on. What do I mean by pattern? And here again, one really needs to see these in print or on a sharp screen. But ecologists parse places. That is, they walk up to a set of cliffs like that. And then they start thinking, okay, I know that kind of place. Rock fall, seepage through cracks, surface flow from the top, ice buildup, ice stripping off, mass movements, talus and colluvium accumulating. They think of a series of places, and then they think, you know, it's not like we were taught in school, these are challenges, the vegetation does pretty poorly, but once in a while it survives. No, no, no. Vegetation knows how to manage every one of those challenges by constructing what I call biostructures. In other words, there are types of vegetation that plants as groups can make that deal with rockfall, that luxuriate in seepage, that grow in the colluvium. That, you know, so then off to the right, there are biostructures, vegetation structures. This is what I want to write about. Well, I've got to work up to it and work up to an audience for it. So I've been practicing. And the practice pieces you will find on our website, and I keep adding to them. There are moss lessons and sedge lessons, and soon there will be tree and grass lessons. So, and they're sort of extended photographic essays that you can download. So, and they're based around this kind of thinking. There's a rock covered with moss. How do you think about it? Well, you start by thinking about it by who the patterns are. You know, who lives where, what the species are there. Okay, but I don't know that. So you may well need a crib sheet to go back and recognize those. But then you start thinking about, okay, what's the next step? Why are those patterns there? And so then you start thinking about physical processes, the way water moves down from the canopy, the way it concentrates, the way it disperses, the way the wind blows through, the way the soil cools air, the way the sun warms soil. And I bring none of this to sharp answers, but nonetheless, when you go pattern, players in the theater, processes, the overall plot, one can see that these things start to fit together. The users of this book will have a lot of work left because I can only do a little. Here's my last example, worked out a little better. And this is also a sedge lesson that's up on the website, and these are only a few of the slides from it. One wants to understand a peatland that is boggy now but was once flooded by beavers. It is in Vermont. I know approximately when the flooding was and how high it was. How do you think about this? Well, you have to start thinking, and this is guesswork, mind you, but you have to start thinking in cross-section and in plan, where the water comes through from, how it moves. And mind you, since the pond goes up and down, those beavers just moved, they didn't leave. Notice I have something called exchange flow, which means that sometimes when the pond is high, The pond is sending water into the meadow. And some parts of the pond, post-beaver, seem to have become mounded again. So they're behaving something like a small raised bog, or at least hummocky bogs. Then you have to think, who's there and where? And how do they relate? So this is what you've seen before. These are ecological maps, species by species. But then you have to think, okay, this is a whole habitat that's made itself in 60 years since the beaver left. What are the processes involved? And again, I can't say super definite things, but you know, the top row is talking about where the sources for these plants come from. Simply diagrammatically, a great deal of expansion. In other words, plants establish and then they spread out. Expansion goes on, canopies are formed, which is a big deal. Individuals come in. And then finally, the whole substructure, the peat layers themselves, are on a much slower time scale, accumulating and degrading. So I have to think about processes. And then once you've sort of tagged this place by who the species are and what the processes are, last slide, and boy, you're a patient bunch, and thank you all. You can start to say, here's where I am. How do I compare a lot of other wetlands with peat in them? How do I sort of make a diagram showing not just the landscape of one wetland, but the landscape of 10 different wetland types, and a little bit how they interconvert to one another? Again, speculation. But so you go from, backtracking very quickly, oops, too far. You go from thinking map, water, and cross sections. I'm getting the wrong ones. Individual distributions, processes, and then you think about which players are involved in those processes. And then you finally spread out from that landscape to a whole landscape of related wetlands. And at that point, if you can, you know, if I can encourage people to do this, I can't tell them what they will see, but I can tell them about how one ecologist thinks about these patterns and encourage them to find a way of thinking about it themselves, with thanks to you all.
Does anybody have questions for Jerry?
I'm a groundwater hydrologist, moved into the Adirondacks, and where I came from, central New York, water quality regimes are very important in affecting the types of vegetation. A carbonate rock, groundwater that goes through that gets a characteristic of carbonate water, high pH, so forth. I see a lot of landscape cross-sections, physical topography, but little information of the groundwater and bedrock geology type beneath, and the potential effects groundwater has on the vegetation type or bedrock type on the vegetation type.
It's, you know, and they both are very important. You know, every working naturalist I know thinks a lot about plumbing and thinks a lot about the underlying materials. So, you know, so no, I completely concur with what you said. But then, I am also simply fascinated by the way that the plants reconfigure the flows once they get into the plant community. So, you know, how to say this in just a couple of words. Two big differences between animals and plants, not absolute. One is that the plants mostly sit where they are. So a plant's survival or a plant community's survival depends on the flows that reach it. And the plants micromanage the flows of air, particulates, propagules, water, nutrients with a vengeance. And number two, plants, unlike most animals, leave structural legacies that last for years, decades, and so on. So the plants actually build plant towns, and the key feature of those plant towns is storage of nutrients and water. So that, you know, to the underlying landscape, you have to add all of this stuff that happens when the flows and the nutrients get to the surface, which are, you know, which are basically banking and dispensing and dispersing and modifying of flow paths. So the whole underlying thing, but then what the vegetation does on top is fascinating, and, you know, not enough written about.
So, in the northern forest that you're studying, I mean, I assume it's all glaciated areas, and so that's kind of a given. But what about aspect? How is aspect taken into account with all this?
You know, I don't know that I've labeled a diagram with north and south and so on. So, you know, and probably I should, but I tend to think as much in terms of cold and warm and wet and dry as I do in terms of pure north and south. So the answer is it's underrepresented right now, and that will probably be something I should think about.
I keep hearing that mycelium and some of the fungi are very important. Could you just comment on that, or am I wrong?
So the question is, are the fungi really important? The answer is yes. Are people learning more and more about the extent of interconnectedness mediated by those fungi? Yes, in a certain sense, the study of soil fungus is less than 20 years old right now. I mean, you know, I was taught in school 50 years ago about them, and they were there, but no one knew what they were, almost. And with DNA and PCR, it's now possible to know exactly who's doing what in a soil. You know, and that comes in the early 2000s. Do I know enough about this? That's an easy question, no. Will I be able to write or picture it in a useful way for a walking naturalist? I do not know. Certainly important, but maybe beyond what I'm capable of doing.
Which book is your favorite? Which book is your favorite? Which one was the most fun?
That's one.
Which of your knittings is your favorite?
All of them.
Okay, next question. Which of your kids is your favorite?
All of them.
They have stayed the same in format, but they have gained complexity. And they've gained a certain, in order to handle that complexity, they've gained a certain fineness of graphic detail, especially in the last 2 volumes. You know, and I think that was necessary. Each one of them has been well, I have a partial answer. Each one of them has been a chance to revisit things, many of them that I've known for 50, 60 or more years. Some that I had never met. But beyond that, also in the photography, a chance to hold in your hands, which you can do with plants, you know, and just simply handle and look at. But then, as I've started doing the ecological maps I and my colleagues have been going back to places, and in some cases I haven't been back to a place for 30 years or more. And the chance to revisit these places and rethink what goes on in them has been just an incredible opportunity.
How big a team do you have working on this?
You got to be really loud because I'm not quite stone deaf, but I come close.
How large a team is working on this project?
Someone relay that to me because I missed one word.
How large of a team do you have working on the project?
Okay. The full-time team is me. The full-time administration of the foundation and the project, Ed McNeil has done that, though by making himself chairman, he managed not to make himself paid for any of the work. He does. But so it's a very narrow team, but we have on our board a number of people who have been very involved, you know, especially in the administration of the project and so on. And then I have 3 colleagues, all of whom that I have worked with for many, many years, botanical colleagues who work for us part-time, but we work in the field together. They find things. Doing the grasses in the 2 COVID summers was quite a challenge because there were 2020 we really couldn't travel. 2021 we couldn't get to Canada and so on. But so they, you know, we've all been working alone for safety's sake, but they, you know, they sort of flood the mail with pieces of grass to me, and then I photograph them. So it's been a small team, but it's without that team, Sue, Glenn, Brett, and then a 4th person who I do the designs and preliminary layouts and put the books together, and then she does all the final graphic editing and adjustment to make it look good. So that's another Susan. So that comes to a 4-person part-time team. We're a pretty lean project. You know, but many of these other books, not all of them, not the Sibley books, which not through an enormous team but many of these other books are made by 1 person, 2 person, one editor, things like that. So there's a lot of small shop work that has made wonderful field guides.
So you'll get a chance to look at them in the flesh there instead of on the screen and see all the products of Jerry's work. So thank you very much, Jerry. Scott.